my great pleasure to welcome all of you here today. We're honored to have David O'Sullivan, the new EU ambassador to Washington, with us. And we're doubly honored because today is his first public event since taking up his new position. So we're really, we thank you for that honor. We're happy to have assumed it. I think all of you, or many of you, probably know that Carnegie has an office in Brussels, and Carnegie Europe is a major part of our network of global offices. So the role of the EU-US relationship, but the EU's relationship with the rest of the world is a major part of Carnegie Endowment's work, and so we are really happy to be hosting this conversation. It is, of course, also taking place just as the new team in Brussels finds their offices. I was there 2 weeks ago, and we were being led to various meetings by people who didn't yet know their way around buildings and didn't yet have phone numbers. So it was indeed very, very early, but still time to get a feel for a very ambitious new team with a clear sense of direction and of some really, I think, quite striking differences, new directions that they plan, and I hope we will hear some about that today. I just want to call to your attention something that is out there as our contribution to this thinking is a study that we released called The New Ambition for Europe, a memo to the EU Foreign Policy Chief. It's a short but very, very condensed and dense result of almost a year of meetings and discussions and with members of governments and experts in Brussels and around Europe on what our experts there feel are the important new directions for the EU. So I commend it to you as you leave. You will perhaps find it interesting. So our hope today is to hear Ambassador O'Sullivan's thoughts on his goals, the EU's goals, new directions. I think we will hear from him first, and then I hope have a rich discussion with all of you. Just to say the formalities, Ambassador O'Sullivan was previously the Chief Operating Officer of the European External Action Service. He has held a range of senior EU positions, including as the Director General for Trade and Secretary General of the European Commission. So he can comment with authority on TTIP as well as Ukraine, Iran, and everything else that's on the agenda. So we're eager to hear your thoughts, and thank you again for joining us today.
Well, Jessica, thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to Carnegie for giving me this opportunity to have a first public explanation of how I see my next 4 years. I'm obviously very excited and pleased to be in Washington at what is an interesting time. Unfortunately, I fear these days everything is an interesting time. So Cathy Ashton used to tell me that when she was interviewing people for the jobs of ambassadors, her favorite question was to ask the individual, well, how will you define success after 4 years in your job, in whichever position? And as you can imagine, this often used to throw people off, because I don't know if diplomats are actually used to being sort of set themselves operational benchmarks of success. Usually, I think we feel just being there is already a great sense of success. So I've been trying to ask myself, I'm going to be like most diplomats. I'm not actually going to answer the question, but what I think is, for me, if I ask myself what do I think is the key role of the EU ambassador, in Washington, it is to continue, I think, the work begun by my predecessors, João Vela de Almeida as the first EU ambassador, but even, frankly, people here who are here also on behalf of the Commission, but speaking on behalf of the EU more generally, to try and consolidate the understanding in this part of the world of the EU as such as being a very important partner to the United States across a wide range of issues. I know that one of the things I'll spend a certain amount of time doing is simply explaining what is the EU, how does it work, what exactly, where does the EU begin and end, what's the distinction between the EU and the member states. I fully accept that in terms of brand image, to use a commercial expression, there's a certain amount of justifiable confusion between Europe, the EU, NATO, the Council of Europe. Today is Human Rights Day. We have the European Convention on Human Rights and a separate court on human rights. We have the European Court of Justice, which is the Supreme Court of the European Union. So I fully accept that, to people who don't take a passionate interest in these affairs, one of the things is simply to explain how all this fits together. But I think what has become clear over recent times is that the EU is not simply the European Economic Community as we once knew it. It is not simply a trading bloc or an exercise of commercial integration. The EU has grown geographically. We have expanded progressively over the last 50 to 60 years to now cover a substantial part of the European continent. The reunification which took place in 2004 of the first enlargement to the 10 former communist states. One of my first jobs in the European Commission was relations with Comecon. I'm glad to see that Comecon, the European Union, has known a better, has been a growth industry, whereas Comecon has been a somewhat shrinking market. But many of the countries that I was then dealing with are now members of the European Union. And to be very frank, back in 1979, if you'd said to me, is it imaginable that 20 years from now we will be debating bringing these countries as democracies into the European Union, I would have said it was impossible. And I think these are huge achievements which we have managed. Also, of course, as a foreign policy and security actor, I think the situation in Iran, in Ukraine, Russia, has shown that very often it is the EU as such which is the best interlocutor for the United States in terms of, for example, sanctions policy, in terms of the recent crises in Africa, where we have also seen the EU taking on a certain level of action. So the EU is increasingly a foreign policy actor, a security actor. Of course, economics plays a hugely important role. The EU is an important economic and commercial partner of the United States. We are, taken collectively, the largest economy in the world. You'll forgive me, but I'm often amused when our American and Chinese friends debate which they think is the first or second economy in the world. They're actually arguing about second and third place. The EU is the largest trading bloc in the world. We are the largest importer, we're the largest exporter, we're the largest trading partner of many, many countries around the world, starting with China. And many countries in Southeast Asia, we're the largest market, we're their largest export market after China. We're the largest block of foreign direct investment, both inward and outward. So these are, and we have a very active trade negotiation agenda. Not only are we negotiating now with the United States, we've just concluded with Canada. We have many agreements in Latin America, and we are negotiating extensively in Asia. We're currently negotiating a free trade agreement with Japan, with Thailand, with Vietnam, with Malaysia. We've just concluded with Singapore. I personally concluded the agreement with Korea. So sometimes when people talk about Europe's external footprint, I think they sometimes forget that we are also, you've had a pivot to Asia. We've been involved and heavily involved in Asia for a long time and are very, very, very committed to the region. In terms of security, of course, we have many military and defense missions. We've been a leading force in the Atalanta mission off the coast of Africa in anti-piracy, which has been, I think, a hugely successful operation. But we've also, because we're the world's largest donor of development assistance, we've taken a holistic view to this question, because we've understood that it's one thing to have ships on the sea combating pirates, but you have to actually ask yourself why young Somalis think makes more sense to grab a Kalashnikov and jump into a speedboat and try to hijack an oil tanker than it is to actually find a job and see a future in their own country. So we're heavily involved in what we see as the comprehensive approach. In other words, looking at problems from a global perspective, that you also have to, you may need an immediate security intervention, but then you have to help people rebuild. You have to help look at the governance, the institutions in countries, help them build a future and an economy. And Africa we talk about our neighborhood. Africa is, for me, our extended neighborhood. It's a hugely important continent for Europe. And we're heavily invested there, not only in trying to deal with the different crises, whether this was in Mali or in the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Sudan, but we're also heavily engaged with the African Union. We're one of the largest funders of the African Union peacekeeping operations, because we believe that the real future for Africa is that Africa should be able itself to manage peacekeeping operations. And of course, we face huge economic challenges, but one should never forget that notwithstanding the great crisis which we've just come through, and which we are still, frankly, struggling to emerge from, and I don't deny that we have many challenges. We're certainly, unfortunately, at a rather different point in the economic cycle than the United States just at the moment. But again, you have to also see where this came from. The euro remains the world's second largest reserve currency, and frankly, in spite of all the doom and gloom, it has continued to be a strong currency. I've always been somewhat surprised that even at the moments of greatest pessimism about the future of the euro, its value remained actually perhaps excessively high, I would almost say, from a European perspective. I have a personal declaration to make, and some people maybe made some money out of it, but anytime I set foot on the North American continent, the currency in which I earn my money devalues. So I actually warned people 6 months ago that it was a good bet that when I arrived in Washington, beginning of November, that the euro might start to go down. And unfortunately, it's true. But I've never spent as long as 4 years in America, so I don't know. I'm interested to see whether this becomes a long-running theory or whether it will actually move up again. But I think that the point is that the euro has been a success, in my view, frankly, unashamedly. But the financial crisis hit us hard. It put strains on the system, which, frankly, perhaps had not been necessarily anticipated at an earlier stage. But I think there's a huge amount of positive in the way that we've addressed these problems. We've now created banking union, which is a huge step forward in Europe, and we are working our way. The individual countries are working their way through the difficulties. My own country, Ireland, has known a hugely difficult period, but is now emerging. I think the same can be said of Spain and Portugal. I also think the situation in Greece has improved. I know we have now this snap elections I saw in the announced, but I'm still very confident that there is huge determination within Europe to address these issues and to go forward. And I remember when I used to come here in the 90s, people were rather pessimistic about the European economy because our unemployment was at that, I think, 21%, and unemployment here was about 7%. 10 years later, we were outperforming the United States. We had addressed many of our difficulties. At the beginning of this century, people said the German economy was in serious difficulty. I remember an article on the front page of The Economist saying Germany, the sick man of Europe. And by the way, one of the problems was they were meant to have joined the euro at an excessively high exchange rate, and that they were going to suffer from this. Now we're being told that Germany benefits from the euro unfairly. So these things go in cycles. And I think the European this new Commission is absolutely determined to address the economic and employment issues, which we know we have. We know we have a competitiveness issue. By the way, I think all aging OECD economies have the same problem. Japan, you have it in the US, even if I must say your economic performance is now much better. But I think you face some of the similar problems of how we reinvent ourselves in the 21st century with many, many different challenges coming from other parts of the world. And I think that we will find solutions to these problems. And then that brings me finally to the fact that, of course, trade is not a solution in itself to problems, but it is true that the bulk of economic growth in the next 10 to 15, 20, 30 years is going to come outside the OECD area. And this is Asia, this is hopefully Latin America, which is a continent of huge potential, and even Africa, which I think, notwithstanding many of the huge difficulties that continent faces, there are also many positive signs. So open markets are the only way in which we in the OECD world will be able to benefit from some of this additional growth which will be taking place. And that's why I think that the trade agenda is hugely important. Of course, the trade negotiations with the US, in my view, offer us a huge opportunity to benefit both economies. There would be immediate benefits from getting rid of many of the tariffs. But of course, the whole area of regulatory cooperation offers, in my view, huge scope for lowering the cost of business. The transatlantic corridor is still by far the most important economic corridor in the world. We talk about trade with Asia. It's very important. I lived in Japan. I'm a great big fan of Asia. But when you actually look at the maths, look at the numbers, it is still transatlantic trade that is hugely important, transatlantic investment. Our companies make many profits with their respective investments in Europe or in the US. Nearly 15 million jobs are created by the cross-investment between the US and the EU. And I think there is much to be gained out of a balanced and ambitious trade deal between us, particularly in the area of regulatory cooperation and convergence. Because I think one of the challenges we're going to face is how we deal with new standards in sectors of the economy which are only emerging, and how, with the combined economic might of the United States and the EU, I believe we can have a positive influence on the development of global standards by increasing regulatory cooperation between us. And this, I think, would be another huge benefit of the trade negotiation which we have at the moment. So these are the many areas of activity that we have between the EU and the US. Of course, we're 28 member states. I see one former close colleague and ambassador of Spain in the room. I'm delighted to work very closely with our member states. We still have a bilateral agenda. This is what makes life complicated perhaps for some people, because we are at a stage of development where many things are done at European level, but many things are still done at national level. And this is a balance which we have it now, which ebbs and flows a bit. Sometimes we decide we need to do more things at European level. There's even a debate about whether there may be some things we do at European level that might go back to the level of our member states. The European Union is a living organism. It's rooted in democracy, the same values we have with the United States: democracy, rule of law, human rights, defense of rights, and it grows and develops. And frankly, I don't think anyone knows exactly where this European Union project will finally end. And I don't think anyone should seek to define that in advance. But as I say, across all of these areas, cooperation with the United States is hugely important. For me, we are each other's best friend of last resort. Who do you call at 3 o'clock in the morning when you wake up and you think things are going wrong? You ring your best friend. And I think we have that kind of relationship across the Atlantic. I've heard many Americans say that, and I know that that's the way we feel in Europe, that at the end of the day, the relationship with America is hugely important, both for our foreign policy, for our security, for our economics, and, as I say, for our shared values, which is something that is definitely going to be challenged in the 21st century with alternative models of politics and of human rights. So that's what I'd just like to say by way of introduction, but obviously I'm very happy to talk about any of these issues or any other issues that you'd like to raise. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. I can't resist sharing a story of a comparable awful moment in a job interview, being asked to define success. When I was first interviewed by Zbig Brzezinski for a position on the National Security Council staff, I was 30 years old. I walked in, I sat down, he said, "How would you solve the Israeli-Palestinian dispute?" I was not being interviewed for a job that had anything to do with the Middle East.
I see. Oh, okay.
And there was a long, quiet period there. But your comment brought it to mind. Before we turn to everybody else, can you give us a sense of how well you think the EU and the U.S. are doing working together on the Ukraine crisis, which is one that touches both certainly hard security and values in a more acute way than perhaps any other issue that of recent years?
Yeah, I think we've done remarkably well. I think we have more or less moved in good step. Of course, these things are complicated. It's true that for us, sanctions against Russia were difficult because, frankly, they cause more economic pain in the EU than they do in the United States. We trade 15 times more with Russia than you do. So clearly, it's one thing in Washington to say, "Hey, let's have sanctions against Russia." Another thing to say it in Europe. And I think the remarkable thing is that, notwithstanding some of the doubts and some of the legitimate concerns, the European Union has gone ahead with some very tough sanctions against Russia and has maintained very close relations with the United States. I think we see eye to eye on the need to support Ukraine and to help Ukraine through this situation, to send a tough message to Russia. I think we also see eye to eye that at some point we need perhaps to try to get to some sort of resolution of this issue, that sanctions themselves will not solve the problem. But this takes two to tango, and frankly, I don't think we feel that from the Russian side yet we've had the sort of response which would enable us to build that kind of political process. But I think that has to be our medium-term objective. The idea of 20 or 30 years of constant confrontation with Russia is certainly not viewed with any enthusiasm in Europe, but frankly, I don't think it's viewed with much enthusiasm by many policymakers in the United States either. So I think on this, we're very much on the same page. I think we have cooperated very closely, and I think it is the intention of our respective political authorities to maintain that unity of purpose throughout this crisis.
Well, I have half a dozen questions, but I want to engage the group. Please wait for, there's a lady there with blonde hair for the microphone, and please do introduce yourself as soon as you can.
Hi, my name is Molly O'Neill. I'm with Johns Hopkins SAIS. I jumped to the first question just because it follows on from what you were just discussing on Ukraine. I have two questions, really. I wondered if you would have any willingness to comment upon the role that the EU's external, the partnership, the Eastern Partnership, and the attempt to, build a free trade relationship or association agreement with Ukraine. What role, if any, do you think that may have played in inadvertently creating a crisis? And is there a problem of coherence in the EU as far as its external role is concerned? I'm not saying I think there is, but I just wonder if there's any sort of effort of reflection around whether, the steps that were taken were wise in terms of the consequences that have followed. And the other question I'll ask you is about the attempts to resolve the situation. I see that while the EU was very involved in the inception of the crisis, it seems, from my standpoint, that the EU is not very involved now in the attempts to resolve it. It seems that the leading role has been taken by the OSCE, on the resolution side. Obviously, on the sanctions side, the EU is still influential. Is there a role for the Mogherini, for example, in the EU external, foreign affairs leadership to enter once more into an attempt to resolution? Is there more that the EU could be doing? So those are my questions.
Well, on your first question, I've obviously heard that, and you emphasized, you asked the question, you weren't necessarily agreeing with the implicit suggestion that somehow the EU contributed to making this happen. I've heard this many times, and I profoundly disagree. What was the Eastern Partnership about? The Eastern Partnership was about offering to those countries, formerly a part of the Soviet Union, now independent, a choice about how they wanted to take forward their country. Basically, all we were offering was a comprehensive free trade agreement, which would give them full access to the European market, which is the richest market in the world of 500 billion consumers, and the possibility to upgrade their standards and their way of doing business in order to interact with the European market. This was not exclusive of anyone. We never suggested to these countries that they should do anything but other than continue to have very strong economic ties elsewhere, particularly with Russia. But to be very frank, I don't think these countries felt that the economic relationship they had, and most of them have free trade agreements with Russia, that offered the same perspective of prosperity and development and diversification of their economy as did a free trade agreement with the EU. But, I mean, you don't have to be a trade specialist to know that free trade agreements are not mutually exclusive. We have just signed a very deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with Canada. I didn't notice anyone in the United States saying, hey, they're part of NAFTA, how come you guys want to have a free trade agreement with them? The answer is you can have you can be a serial free trader, and many countries do. And to be very frank, the notion that we were somehow treading on Mr. Putin's toes, I started attending, we used to have two summits a year with Russia. And I started attending those summits when I moved from trade to the External Action Service in 2011. And I think I attended 6 or 7 summits, including, frankly, preceded the night before by dinners in relatively small groups. I never once heard Mr. Putin express any word of criticism about what we were doing with the countries of the Eastern Partnership. I never once heard him say to President Barroso or to President Van Rompuy, hey, what are you people doing? This is treading on my toes. We need to talk about this. I even remember, and President Barroso has said this publicly, so I feel confident to repeat it, a moment when President Barroso attempted to raise the issue and said, you know what we're doing with the free trade agreements with Ukraine and with Armenia? And Mr. Putin, frankly, showed no great interest, changed the subject, and we moved on to talk about something else. So I really do not understand on what basis people can say that somehow it was something the European Union did. All we were doing was going in the direction of the choices of these countries. And for me, unfortunately, the fundamental issue in this is the extent to which Russia recognizes the sovereign right of choice of these independent countries to make arrangements which they feel are appropriate for their own future. We never saw it as ruling out close ties, economic ties with Russia. On the contrary, we've been trying to discuss the possibility of a free trade agreement with Russia for many years. We were the ones, I must say also with the United States, who strongly supported Russian WTO accession, even though we knew that this might create some problems. And by the way, whereas China, in my view, became a relatively good global citizen in the WTO, the Russian experience has been, frankly, somewhat less positive. We've had quite a lot of difficulties with the Russian adjustment. So I must say, I think that we have been extremely consistent in our position, which was to allow these countries the kind of interaction with the European Union that they wanted, and absolutely not at the expense of close relations with Russia. On the question of the EU role, I think that we have, of course, at all stages tried to reach out in the beginning we were closely focusing on Ukraine. Then after the annexation and the Russian involvement in eastern Ukraine, which we deeply regret, the question of dealing with Russia very much became a question of dealing with Mr. Putin, because it had to happen at that level. I think it was very much at that level. And there has been a lot of interaction by the European side. As you know, many of the European leaders, Chancellor Merkel, President Hollande, there were meetings in the margins of the Normandy meetings. There were attempts. There have been many meetings to try to find a way forward, but unfortunately it seems to prove very difficult. So I think hopefully we now have President Tusk, who's taken over as President of the European Council. We have President Juncker, we have Federica Mogherini. I think the European door is open to discuss with Russia ways in which we can de-escalate this situation and try to move to a more normal situation. But frankly, that does require Russia to want to do that, and I'm not sure that there is a whole lot of evidence just at the moment that is the case, unfortunately.
Maybe I'll take 2 or 3 questions together, and so that we can. There's a gentleman right next to you, and then we'll do the gentleman blue shirt. And
thank you, Jim Berger from Washington Trade Daily. Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned that the great bulk of economic growth over the next 20, 30 years will be non-OECD countries in Asia and Africa. You're probably right. And given that point, don't you think it's time for the United States and the European Union to get down to serious business on the Doha round and do something multilaterally?
Okay, Doha, right here.
Henry Farrell, George Washington University. 2 short questions about privacy. First of all, in the wake of the NSA problems, the US suggested that it was willing to try to pursue a legislative solution whereby legislation will be introduced to protect the privacy of European citizens. I was wondering if you could comment on how you assess the prospects for such legislation, especially after the recent elections. And secondly, we're seeing sometime next year probably the new regulation coming down in the EU on privacy. What kinds of consequences is this going to have transatlantically?
Okay, and the gentleman right there with the white tie. And then I'll go over here.
Thanks very much. This is a slightly broader question, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Michael Stopford, and I'm with a company called Weber Shandwick, a public affairs company. You talked about brand image when you began, and before coming here, I ran NATO's public diplomacy. And it's a fairly broad question for you. Do you find it difficult, or it strikes me that it might be difficult, to represent the EU at a time when there's a certain lack of enthusiasm for the European ideal at home? I mean, if you think about UKIP, or if you think about the Sweden Democrats, etc. And I was wondering, does this concern you, and how might you think about addressing it in terms of public diplomacy here in the US?
Interesting question. So, Doha, privacy, and
Right.
And enthusiasm, and the EU brand.
Well, let me make two comments. Firstly, the EU is very committed to multilateralism and to the WTO, and I think we actually share that also with the United States. I lost 5 years of my life on the Doha development agenda, so I think I've given. But we very reluctantly came to the conclusion this was not going to work. Now, I don't want now to do the autopsy of why it didn't work. I suppose, to be very honest, all of us around that table had to take some responsibility because somehow we should have made it work. We didn't. And the alternative, the only other way in which you could build trade liberalization was to go bilateral at that point. And we took that step reluctantly, and always saying that we believed we should get back to Geneva at some point and multilateralize whatever it is we do bilaterally. But if we want to continue the agenda of trade liberalization, I'm afraid this is the only option which is currently available, leaving aside what is being done in the Geneva context, whether this is the the technology agreement, the ITA, or the trade and services attempts, or what was done in Bali on trade facilitation. And we haven't completely given up. I know that Director General Azevedo would still like to try and take forward the Doha round, and there's a ministerial at the end of next year. So we will hope that this can happen. But the reality is that if we believe, as I do, that trade is unequivocally beneficial to all the people involved, both in terms of importers, exporters, increasing welfare, increasing rational use of resources, then we have to keep our markets open and keep opening them. We have done this with the developing countries. We are the only major trading bloc, the EU, which offers full duty-free, quota-free access to least developed countries. We have continued to, we have just finished our set of negotiations with the African countries to open our markets fully to, in the way that we had under the Cotonou Agreement, and which the WTO forced us to renegotiate through the economic partnership agreements. So we are one of the largest markets for developing countries. Contrary to common opinion, we're also one of the largest markets for agricultural exports, including from the developing world. And we are continuing to engage with the United States, with Canada, with Japan, with the countries of ASEAN in terms of opening up trade across the board, trade and services, and, of course, investment. So that's the agenda, but I absolutely agree. The WTO is one of the cornerstones of global prosperity, and we absolutely have to keep working at trying to get that organization to deliver. And I sincerely hope that in due course we will all go back to Geneva and multilateralize much of what has been done bilaterally by which was necessitated by the inability of, whatever it is, the 163 countries that we now have in the WTO to find a global agreement. On privacy, this is a very important issue. We are engaged in negotiations for two agreements, one an umbrella agreement and the other the safe harbor agreement. As part of this process, we're very encouraged by the proposal of the United States to make the necessary legislative steps to give European citizens the same right of judicial redress which American citizens currently have. We know that work on this is ongoing. We know it's a legislative process. It's going to take a little bit of time, but we're very hopeful that this will be delivered upon in due course, and that this would greatly facilitate the flow of data and confidence in the flow of data across the Atlantic. On the question of the image of the EU, well, look, I'm a passionate believer in European integration. And I think that the EU has delivered remarkably positive outcomes for all of our citizens across Europe, not just in terms of the single market. I mean, the fact that you can travel freely across, that you can work, the economic opportunities it has created, the peace, the reconciliation, the rule of law, the transparency, Europe-wide competition rules. I think these are all unequivocally positive. But we have not actually tried to homogenize, contrary to what everyone thinks, Europe into some sort of amorphous brand Europe. I know when I land in Berlin, I'm in Germany. I know when I land in Copenhagen, I'm in Denmark. I know when I go to Madrid, I'm in Spain. I'm under no illusion that feels, sounds, touches like another country. And in fact, there's a huge range of policy scope for member states while still being part of the European Union. Now, there are those who don't like it. There are those who question it. We should not be afraid of this debate. People are entitled to disagree. But I think that when you actually look at the arguments they put forward and you say, what's the alternative? What is your model of Europe in the 21st century? Frankly, many of these people who are critical of Europe come also with baggage of other policies, which I must say as a European citizen I would not feel very comfortable with. Whether this is in terms of their perception of foreigners or xenophobia or a model of government or even a model of economic government with openness versus closed doors or sort of some kind of restrictiveness. And I think we have to make this case. But we do live in a democracy. Europe is fundamentally democratic, and we cannot ignore the fact that there are many people who feel alienated, who don't identify with this system, and we have to make the case. And we have to, every morning, if you're a European civil servant, every morning you get out of bed, you have to get up there and make the case and continue. And member states have to make the case, and national governments have to make the case why their countries are better off inside the EU than outside it. But yes, there are those who don't agree. And they're entitled to that view. And the European Parliament has now a much larger number of Euro-critical, some Eurosceptic, some Euro-critical groups. And they're perfectly entitled to come to the Parliament, to make their case, to say what they would do, how they would vote, how they would wish to see the Europe governed in the 21st century. And in due course, we will see at the ballot box who wins. But I'm under no doubt that the future of our citizens, the future of our prosperity lies in closer integration, the guarantees which the European Union brings. And I believe that ultimately that case will win the day.
That was a great question, a great answer. The gentleman way in the back, and then we'll come up here in the middle and the front. We'll try to get through another round.
My name is David Nikuradze. I represent Georgian television station Rustavito in Washington, D.C. Ambassador, could you give us some updates on what level is EU's cooperation with the Eastern Partnership countries, signatories of the association agreement, which includes visa-free travel? When do you believe these countries, after Moldova, will get the same benefits of visa-free travel? Do you believe the process is going smoothly, or do you see some obstacles that can delay this process? Thanks, sir.
Okay, thank you. There was somebody in the middle there. Yes.
Ambassador, in light of the meetings that you had this week, Jen Riccardi with the Embassy of Luxembourg. In light of the meetings that the Commission had this week with USTR, I was wondering if you could share your views on the path forward for TTIP or a potential timeline for conclusion. Thanks.
Okay. Gentleman right here. And we'll take... well, let's see if we can get through here.
Yeah, my name is Dennis Bornhöft. I'm a German civil servant for the government and also a politician for the Liberal Democrats, but here on vacation. But also a passionate...
It's a European stereotype.
Yeah, I'm also passionate on the European idea. That's why I'm here. But I think we have a problem with the European Union, with a structure. As long as not economic questions, like foreign policies, I remember the Arab Springs and the different positions of the member states on how to act to the Arab Springs, or even taxation politics, financial politics, social politics. Germany is quite good acting now with economics, but Spain, France, and Greece they have much problems. And to make it simple as a question, if you have 3 wishes, I'm a fairy now, which ideas do you have on the structure on the European Union to foster the idea behind it? Thank you.
Okay. Can we do 2 more? And
Okay.
I'm taking notes too.
Good. You can remind me.
Yes.
Hi, Brett Fortnum with Inside U.S. Trade. The U.S. agricultural industry has been rather vocal about their doubt that they're going to have any significant gains because of TTIP. They've also made a point to tell Congress how important their support of that deal will be. So my question is, has the EU done anything to engage the U.S. agricultural industry on the issues that are very important to them, or have they instead decided to focus more on other aspects of the issue, such as the perceived geopolitical importance of TTIP, to try and gain enough congressional support to get passage of the deal?
Thank you. Was there a question here as well?
Archel Gegeshidze, Ambassador of Georgia. Wish you success, although you don't know your operational benchmarks of your success, but I hope that your tenure will be successful, and I'm looking forward to work with you. Here, I have a question regarding EU's energy security. The recent decision of the Russian leadership to reroute its southern stream and to instead of Bulgaria to connect to the Turkish coast. What does it mean in terms of energy security of Europe? what would be the meaning for EU's energy security of that decision, and also for the southern corridor? Because before then, South Stream and Southern Corridor were kind of competitors with each other. But now, does it change the nature of the game, or how do you read the situation? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. So, Moldova and visa-free travel, TTIP timeline, 3 wishes.
Oh, yeah.
Appropriate for this season. The U.S. ag industry and the question of energy security and South Stream. And
on the visa question, I believe very strongly that, and this is the line we've been taking in Europe, that one of the things we have to do is encourage further movement of people between the countries of the Eastern Partnership and the EU. By the way, also Russia, with whom we've also been engaged in visa discussions, though I fear they're not likely to go forward very fast these days. And it is absolutely our intention to grant easier visa access to these countries. There's a process of examining the guarantees, the security guarantees which are needed to be put in place for this to happen. This is a process which is parallel to the negotiation of the association agreements, but it is going forward, and I'm confident that if the countries of the Eastern Partnership can live up to the requirements which are there as part of this process, that we will progressively introduce visa-free travel between the European Union and the countries of the Eastern Partnership, which is our ultimate objective, because I believe that movement of people, exchanges, whether for tourism, whether for professional reasons, whether for students, is absolutely one important way of encouraging greater understanding. On TTIP, and maybe taking also the ag question, no, there's no timeline. And going back to the DDA, I think I've said this many times, but I've seen so many windows of opportunity open and shut that I think we need to be very careful about fixing artificial deadlines. I think we are agreed that we want to take forward this negotiation on TTIP rapidly and with a sense of urgency. But trade negotiations take the time they take, and I think the commitment between Mike Froman and Cecilia Malmström is that the two teams have been instructed to work very hard. We have another round of negotiations in February. We would like to make progress substantially in the next 12, 24 months. But I don't think you can create an artificial deadline. In the end, it is substance over a calendar, and we need to see whether we can make the progress on the issues of substance. On the issue of agriculture, I'm not aware precisely of the points you're making. All I can say is it's absolutely clear to us that a balanced agreement will include increased market access for U.S. agriculture in the EU. This is, of course, we just as we will look for additional market access for our agriculture in the United States. And to be very frank, I think it would be completely wrong to caricature this as an area where America only has offensive and no defensive interests, and vice versa, because there's quite a lot of sensitivities on the U.S. agriculture side too, as I well remember from my Geneva days. So we all know that agriculture is a bit of a special case in trade, and you need to find suitable accommodations, but the objective is to increase market access on both sides of the Atlantic across the full range of our export products. On the question of Europe and my 3 wishes, I'm not going to give you 3 wishes. I only have 1 wish, really. That is that I think one of the biggest problems we have about the image of Europe has been the tendency of national politicians to appropriate to themselves everything that was positive, even when it came from Brussels, and to take the easy way out of blaming Brussels for just about anything that went wrong. I cannot tell you the number of times where I have seen ministers congratulate each other at the end of a discussion in Brussels, say, what a great outcome, what a balanced and fair outcome. Then they go home, and depending on whether the outcome, is very popular or less popular, they will either say, look what I managed to get for you in Brussels, but I had to fight so hard against those people in Brussels. Or, I fought, but unfortunately I couldn't overcome the opposition, and now we're going to have to do this because Brussels have told us to do it. It's a natural reflex. I understand it. Maybe if I was a national politician, I would do the same. But you do that for 30 years, and what seeps into people's minds? It seeps in that actually good things come from the national capital, and the problems come from Brussels. And it's not true. And I think we are paying the price now, some of the Euroscepticism that we're seeing, we're paying the price of, frankly, not having been sufficiently honest with our people about the limits of sovereignty. Because what is the European Union at heart? It's about recognizing that the limits of sovereignty require us to pool our sovereignty in the 21st century in order actually to exercise real sovereignty. I mean, this is self-evident for a country like Luxembourg or Ireland. It maybe is a little less self-evident for a country like Germany or Spain, but even then, as President Barroso always used to like to say, scale will count in the 21st century. And there's a difference between being a bloc of 500 million people trying to influence the rest of the world and being a country of 300,000 or 4 million or whatever. And I think this is a debate we have not sufficiently had with our population in Europe to say it's about the fact that the only way the European countries can really exercise sovereignty over the big questions which affect us, security, foreign policy, trade, we need to work together and to speak with one voice, because then we can have an influence in the world. If we act individually, we will have less impact. That would be my one wish, not three wishes. On energy security, look, this is now a hugely important issue. I think the fact that we have a Vice President of the Commission specifically charged now with the responsibility of energy union, I think we need to look, there is now strong determination to look very closely at how we can lessen our dependence on individual suppliers, particularly Russia, but we need to diversify. And we need to create, I mean, the fact is that one of the big problems we have is not just the fact that some countries are heavily dependent on supplies from one country, but we haven't really got a European grid. We're not able to allow surplus production, for example, from renewables in certain countries to be sent across the frontier to other countries. So there's a whole question of building, and it's not just the infrastructure, it's also about the tariff structure, the pricing structure. So there's a huge potential for developing a Europe-wide energy market, which would have the net result of considerably decreasing our dependence on certain suppliers. We also hope that in the context of TTIP, it may be possible also for the United States to look at some of its restrictions on energy exports, not because it would in itself solve the problem, but because it would create greater liquidity in the energy market generally and contribute to this greater diversification. I think that the moves which Mr. Putin has made with China and with Turkey frankly show that Russia is struggling a bit in the present situation. I mean, like it or not, the EU is the largest market for Russia's exports. It's one thing to say that we're the captive importers, but frankly, he's the captive exporter. And I'm not sure that the deal with China or elsewhere is actually going to compensate if there were to be a significant lowering of European imports of Russian energy exports. So I think that we also have some leverage. We're not just completely dependent. As a big importer, you also have some leverage over your supplier. And I think Russia is beginning to realize that. I would hope that if at some point we can get back to a more normal and regular relationship, we would be delighted to continue to be an important importer of Russian energy products. I mean, it's not that we don't want to do that, but I do think we need to be in a position where we have greater diversity of supply and less risk of being, for some countries, of being quite so dependent on a single supplier.
There are many questions, but unfortunately we're close to time. If I might just close by asking you, it's in relation to your one wish answer. If it turns out we are successful in a nuclear deal with Iran, when you look back over the history of these negotiations, the full history, that has been born principally by the EU. Through all the years, Javier Solana was working away, and when the U.S. refused to engage at all, through these past years, the EU has really been will have been the central player, although at the current time, of course, the U.S. very much. I wondered whether you believe that if it is successful, whether these negotiations may change Europeans' views about what is possible for Europe as a strategic actor as a whole, the EU as a strategic actor. You see it? Or is that an exaggeration?
Well, I think everything contributes. Of course, it is a very good illustration because, in fact, it also shows the complementarity between work at EU level and work at national level, which I think is very important. And I think this is also very important for people in Washington to understand. It's not either the EU or the member states. We work in tandem. We are not the 29th member state. And there are moments when it's the EU as such, so trade negotiations, it's Cecilia Malmström who negotiates on behalf of the 28 member states, of course in close cooperation, but it's still, when in the room there is Cecilia Malmström and Mike Froman, and that's where the deal is done. Then they each have to sell it to their respective constituencies. In the case of Iran, of course, in the room you have France, Germany, and the UK working with Cathy Ashton, who has now been asked by Federica Mogherini to continue her role, but acting still on behalf of the EU. And you see this interrelationship between national activities, because clearly we have two permanent members of the Security Council, and we have Germany as an extremely important player in this particular game. And this shows that there are moments when it's the EU only, there are moments when it's the member states only, and there are moments when it's the EU and the member states working together. And this, I think, is what people have to try and better understand, that it is this complementarity between things which we do at national level, things which we do at European level. I would like to think that a success in this area would help further explain the benefits of EU action. To be very honest with you, Jessica, I suspect it is something which will go over the heads of most European people. I don't think in the pubs and bars and cafes of Europe at the moment, I don't think people are saying, have you seen how the Iran talks are going? Really very impressive performance by the EU. I think we need to be honest. This room, yes, but we have a big problem of popular perception about the EU, which is what worries me. It's not the well-informed people. It's just a general malaise about the future, a concern about globalization, a concern about our economic future, which is driving a sense of frustration, unfortunately, among certain parts of our electorate, who are then rushing to espouse people who are offering simplistic and misplaced solutions, which in my view will ultimately be shown to be cul-de-sacs. But the fact is we have to acknowledge that this is happening, and we have to address it, and we need to address it with some urgency, because if we don't, then the long-term consequences would be very serious.
Right. I think from the range of questions today, it's clear that while it may be hard to predict success, you certainly won't be bored here. And also, I want to apologize to those I couldn't get to. We will have you back and give all those people a chance to pursue it, and in particular to pursue this last question about what can be done to reignite popular support for the EU and greater American understanding of what the project is about. But for this time, I want to thank you for a wonderful conversation and a wonderful audience with great questions as well. So thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.